Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today, working at the epicenter of science, technology, national security. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Jeffrey Bacon, who is currently a program manager at the Intelligence Research Projects Activity, also known as IARPA, focused on biointelligence and biosecurity for a really interesting intelligence community program, B24IC, which is focused on looking at interesting new capabilities in matching synthetic biology and biotech to ultimately help our intelligence community meet biointelligence, biosecurity threats of the 21st century. Dr. Bacon has his bachelor's in science in biology and environmental sciences from Norwich University. He did a master's in engineering management from Missouri University of Science and Technology, did another master's focused on combating weapons of mass destruction with a focus on biodefense from our United States Air Force Institute of Technology. Then he went on to do his PhD at the Fletcher School at Tufts in international relations and national security studies. Previously to this, Dr. Bacon also spent over 25 years in the United States Department of the Army as both a nuclear strategy and counterproliferation officer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Regiment, as well as he also served time as branch chief of the United States Army's Nuclear Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Agency. Dr. Bacon additionally has served as department chair, focused on counterproliferation and information and influence intelligence at our National Intelligence University. He was an interagency chair, an Army senior service advisor at NIU while at the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was a team lead in data analytics and predictive modeling on the Department of Defense Coronavirus Task Force. As well as a former executive officer and program manager at our Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA. We have a lot of really interesting topics to get into today. We're honored to have him with us now. Dr. Jeffrey Bacon, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Ira, thank you. When you read off that bio, it sounds a little funny to hear because it sounds like somebody who hasn't figured out what they want to do when they grow up yet. Because just the diversity of opportunities that I've had over the course of 26 years as an active Army officer. I also can't help but wonder, looking at your previous guest and the esteem and the bona fides they come with, whether or not you made a mistake by having me on today. So I'll do my best to not make you regret it, I promise.
Not at all, Jeff. I mean, you're right up there, and the theme of our show is all about creating a better tomorrow, and clearly, whether it's nuclear or biologic threats, these are important to have the really smart people like you focused on. So I'm glad you're there doing what you've been doing over the last few decades. But Jeff, I'd love to start off, as we typically do, by handing things to you just for a little bit. Love to learn a little bit more about who Jeff Bacon is, where you grew up, what got you interested in some of these, fascinating intellectual pursuits, a little bit of the early days, obviously, and what got you interested in national service in the United States Army.
Okay, super. Ira, not to go too far into my origin story, but I was a punk kid growing up in the estuaries of the Delaware River Basin in southern New Jersey. Came from a big family. So when it came time to figure out what the next step was beyond high school, college was there, but we had to figure out how to pay for it. So I remember walking into the local community college for a college fair and seeing some crusty old chief petty officer in the Navy with a chest full of ribbons and a Stark uniform. And he asked me about, if I had any interest in going to one of the academies. Piqued my interest as a way to get to university. If you're going to apply to the academies, you might as well look at ROTC scholarships. The Army ended up, throwing the most money at me from a scholarship perspective. At which time I took that up to Vermont. Again, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, making decisions for perhaps not the best informed reasons, but I love snowboarding and skiing and had a soft spot in my heart for New England and Vermont. So I thought if I was going to the military, it made sense to go to a military school. I love the Vermont. It just made sense to head up north to Norwich University, which is, I later learned during the admissions process, the oldest private military college in the nation and the founder of ROTC. So it's got a fascinating history. It was a good place for me to go up to and focus on school. There wasn't much trouble to get into without a significant road trip. So it was focused on academics, athletics, and kind of fitness and getting ready for, a career in the military. I opted for a scientific, kind of academic career path because that was kind of a condition of my scholarship. And now the Army didn't specify; they pretty much said do something in math and science. And there's a tangent that I'll run down later in terms of whether or not we do a great job of utilizing, officers' academic skill sets, in their actual career fields. And we're getting better, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and I've got some strong opinions about it. But I grew up on the river and the bay of the Delaware River down in South Jersey, crabbing, fishing, and just running around having a lot of fun in marsh boats. A constant presence throughout my childhood was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, right? So they've got the Navigable Waterways mission. So every few years they were out there dredging, and they were active in my local community through things like regulations and restoration of wetlands. So they were a presence in my home turf. Now I said I'm from South Jersey. Our listeners can poke fun of me as they will. We earn a lot of our stereotypes fairly. I grew up 10 minutes upriver from 3 nuclear reactors, and I think 15 minutes downriver from Citgo and DuPont's.
Right.
So there's significant industry in that area. The nuclear industry, with what's called, PSE&G's artificial island growing up, was a primary employer for a lot of the folks in my hometown. So it was very agrarian, a lot of farmland. The Garden State earns its name for a reason where I'm from, but we also, like I said, drew power from 3 nuclear power plants, 3 nuclear reactors, right down river from me. Clearly there was an interest, in nuclear energy, but I kind of tabled that for a little while once I was in school. That came back later on when I had an opportunity to change career fields. But, Norwich University for 4 years, opted to go Corps of Engineers as a branch, to no surprise, given my early exposure to them coming out of school. A lot of folks realize that not everything's recruiting videos and posters when you first join the Army. It's also not all peeling potatoes and guard duty. There's some fun things to be had, and it falls someplace in between. But my first 6 to 8 years in the Army looked a whole lot like a tactical combat engineer, right? So that included tours of Fort Hood as a mechanized sapper, and kind of culminated with a tour in Iraq for a year where I was a company team commander of a bunch of engineers, 100 engineers that were task organized like motorized infantry, and everything in between to include peacekeeping, kind of standard, serving in peacetime in places like Texas, Germany, Fort Leonard, Missouri, etc. So that kind of gets you through the first third of my career. And with that, the Army does a great job of sprinkling opportunities to go back to school. And I had a chance to go back, as part of my kind of in line with my professional military education as an engineer. That's when I went to the University of Missouri. Once I got overseas, my wife and I spent about 4 years there. We came back stateside, and we kind of looked at each other, and we realized that we had just spent 4 years in Germany, and during that time probably spent about a year and a half together. So while I love the Army, I certainly love my family, and it was important for me to make sure that I had that work-life balance. So we looked at each other and said, all right, it makes sense to stay in or get out, but this is our decision point. And the timing is such where it just kind of made sense to do that. We were living in southern New Jersey. I was working for the Philadelphia Corps of Engineers. So again, kind of a full circle. The same engineers that I watched out in the river, I was now working on dredge programs for the Navy on the Delaware River, or I was doing civil works for the state of Delaware, or Dover Air Force Base. But we looked at kind of the way forward for our family and decided something needed to change. And I also wanted to have additional opportunities to go back to school and kind of revisit the scientist in my heart that I had to kind of table for the previous 8 years as a dusty boots engineer. So we opted to voluntarily transfer into what's called the Functional Area 52 community, which, as you kind of pointed out in your intro, is a terrible name, but Nuclear Strategy and Counterproliferation Officer. It's for a small group of officers, 300 or so plus of us, that serve at the highest echelons within the Army to understand what the effects of nuclear weapons might be on ground operations. So pretty much the Air Force and the Navy own our nuclear or strategic nuclear arsenal. There are a lot of folks that work tirelessly to ensure its readiness and the surety of it. National labs, across the DoD, but we have to figure out how to fight in it and understand what its impacts might be on ground operations as commanders. But that takes you, and it gave me additional school opportunities, which are great. And then puts you kind of in a career path where, and my thinking at the time was the ways to impact the fight during that moment in time, which we're talking, mid 2000, 2005, 2007. If I'm no longer leading troops at a company level, then I'm just going to be a staff officer. I want to make sure that I'm serving at a position where I'm high enough that I've got a chance to make a difference and to have a strategic impact. And with the decision to switch over, to the Functional Area 52 community, that came with additional schooling opportunities, and then we returned back to the DC footprint, which it was important for me to be back in the Mid-Atlantic so I could be near family and loved ones like parents and grandparents who were getting a little bit older. The bulk of our jobs are going to be found in the DC area, the National Capital Region, because we're serving at major commands or higher level. So the days of serving in the Great Green Tactical Army, down at the division and below level, were kind of past me. Transferred over to this new community. It gave some additional education opportunities. And then, my first duty assignment or utilization tour was in the National Capital Region, where a lot of my peers will serve, because they're serving at the COCOM level and higher, to kind of influence the policy and the planning for both non-proliferation, counterproliferation, and consequence management, mission space across the Army and really the DoD. I ended up serving at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which was a great job and a really neat agency. Like a lot of reform that happened post 9/11, you saw things like DHS bring together a lot of disparate agencies and equities across the federal government. Well, DTRA was no different. Its legacy dates back to, really the Manhattan Project and the early evolution of our strategic nuclear arsenal. But at this point, it's this wonderful kind of combination of equities that include everything from like hard research and development on the sovereignty problems, but also the cooperative threat reduction program, right, which is kind of an extension of our diplomacy and our State Department efforts. Planning support and operations, where they push officers like me and smart scientists and engineers out to the commands who have real world problems and are dealing with this kind of space. So that brought me all over the world, short tours in Korea, support to the Fukushima crisis in Japan, over to Europe for training missions, NATO, to help support planning. And it's really kind of a neat place where I spent almost 4 years at DITRA, 3 years in research and development, and then my last year in the operations division or component of DITRA, which again was a great introduction really to my community and a great first utilization tour, because you get a chance to see so much of really the DoD, but also kind of the broader interagency's contributions toward the CWMD fight.
Yep.
And it's a neat space. There are folks that do good work every day to help keep us safe, and without much fanfare, we're noticed. And it's been ongoing for decades at this point. And I know they've continued to grow and evolve. On the back end of my time at DITRA, I ended up at the Army staff, which you pointed out, at the U.S. Army Nuclear CWMD Agency, which is really our major or our lead organization for the Army in terms of managing the CWMD planning and operation support, and kind of tangentially contributing to our strategic nuclear deterrence mission. So there's a group of Army officers that are part of the Army staff, that help contribute to, planning as well as oversight of things like, what used to be the Army's nuclear reactor program, which is kind of an interesting legacy that is starting to get interest again, with policy that's pointing us towards challenges of climate change. And power has always been a problem, right, for a force looking to project power globally. So you're seeing a lot of things thanks to folks like Bill and Melinda Gates, where there's interest in small modular reactors again, that are really adding some energy back into really an industry that has continued to just kind of chug along, and wait for policy to catch up to where I think we need to be moving forward to be responsible and have a sustainable power system. We have the same challenges, right, that our national government and population has. It's sometimes exacerbated or a little more fine pointed in the DoD and what we do, but similar challenges and similar opportunities. So after serving there at Fort Belvoir in a couple different capacities, I threw my name in the hat for and was selected for the National Intelligence University's Professor of Strategic Intelligence program. Another great naming convention for a faculty member at the National Intelligence University. So I was selected, ahead of some peers, and with that came another opportunity to go back to school. I was fully prepared to go back and continue my research on inactivation strategies on Bacillus anthracis, Bacillus thuringiensis, right, a common surrogate for anthrax, because that to me was still an important area that we continue to learn all these years later, right, on one of the earliest agents known for relation to cause of disease.
Yep.
We still invest millions of dollars to try to break the code on that very difficult traditional biological agent. I was wholeheartedly prepared to go back, continue to investigate that, and understand how we could hold threat stockpiles at risk, through different types of inactivation strategies.
Okay.
But I had a peer sit me down and say, look, your benchtop days are quickly going the way of the dodo. You've got to grow up, think more strategically in your contributions to the broader DoD, the intelligence security apparatus. So with that, I started looking at other programs, that were perhaps a little more broadening. I never set out to get a degree in international relations, but I knew what I wanted to do research on, and I was always fascinated by our ability to respond to a biological, naturally occurring pandemic, a biological crisis. And truth in advertising, I'm a bit of a minority even within my field. Most of my peers in the 52 community are nuclear engineers, physicists, or they're folks that come from an operational background that have had some CWMD experience. So perhaps a bit of a counterculture in me, where I'm a biologist, serving in a field where there's a nuke heavy population. So it was fascinating to me to kind of continue to explore that. I always felt like that was something that, was where my passion was. Cast a wide net. My family and I love New England. We love Boston. So we looked mostly here in the DC footprint, but we also looked up in New England, which we consider kind of a second home. And it was an easy answer once Tufts, where I found some faculty that were interested in what I was looking at there at Tufts, Dr. Bob Falsgraf, and that led me up to the Fletcher School. So sounded like a really great idea to go. I found a welcoming faculty and staff up at Tufts that really encouraged me to go up there and get outside my comfort zone. Never set out to get an international relations degree. Sounded like a great idea as a STEM guy with degrees in physical sciences and engineering. Then all of a sudden transitioning over to the social sciences. But to be honest, Ira, really kicked my backside. I had strong peers who had been doing this for 7 years or more, and were really talented and had a perspective on the world that I just that was eye-opening to me. So I won't say that it was easy switching over to the social sciences, as much fun as that would be, as somebody who comes from a STEM background, but it was super good for me because it really gave me, a perspective that I did not have. I mean, even our, the educational cohort that I walked into when I showed up to Fletcher, I think there were 61 countries represented. So, middle-aged guy with a family, walking onto campus, with a STEM background, I was totally a fish out of water. It was great, a wonderful experience, that really put me on a journey of a 5-year, kind of pursuit towards my PhD. But I think ultimately prepared me to go back and then take on duties there at the National Intelligence University, where I had teaching responsibilities really across the WMD spectrum, but also some of our core classes that are more focused on, how do we build a professional intelligence community and the intelligence officer of the future? And that was great. There was, the National Intelligence University is predominantly a graduate teaching institution.
Yep.
Every student that comes through there is cleared at the TSSCI level and is some form of government employee. So the beauty is nobody shows up there because they've got to. These are all adult learners who are passionate about being lifelong learners and sharpening their skill set in either the field of intelligence or in one of the functional spaces like I offered in CWMD or Counterproliferation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really the most rewarding aspect of what I did there. Teaching on the lectern to a student population that really is amazing. And some of them come with such amazing experiences. You get everything from young Army officers who were literally infantrymen a month before and then transferred over to be strat intel officers, and compare them with an analyst who's been working on Region X functional space Y for the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they go back to school because they competed for the 1 or 3 slots that their home organization gives to go full time, because they want to step up to that next level of management or kind of change the path of their career in a positive way, and they see NIU as a reason for that. One of the things that I wish we could talk about, but we won't here, is most of the students do research in the classified space, and that's one of the things that makes NIU so unique. Is I've had some great opportunities. I've had multiple academic opportunities, thanks to the Army, but I've never had a space where I could look at the entire literature, both academic as well as classified reporting, to then put together, a position paper or an evidence-based, kind of thesis, that incorporates all of those resources, to include yesterday's intel that we're able to bring right into the classroom because of, the opportunities afforded by the National Intelligence University and the space that it provides. So it's a pretty fascinating place that, as a faculty member, as a student, I think was a great opportunity. So I really enjoyed teaching there for 5 years. We spent time, early as an adjunct, and then, was given the opportunity to serve as a department chair, where I owned both the counterproliferation concentration as well as the information and influence intelligence concentration, right? So something that's become all the more important,
Oh, yeah.
in certainly the last decade, as we see this convergence of really social media and kind of a more globally integrated society, and the challenges that come with that, the opportunities and the challenges that come with that. And that was a neat space to learn about. I don't come from a background as an information operations officer, or what used to be called psychological operations. So had a chance to become a department chair, where I was responsible for the counterproliferation of the CWMD concentration, as well as the information and influence intelligence concentration. It's kind of a strange hodgepodge to put those two together, but if you look at our historical use of things like denial and deception, which are important in information ops, there's a close tie and a lot of great case studies that date back through the Cold War, between the Soviets and the United States, that really make it a fun space to look at. So it doesn't make sense, at face value, but it does when you start to peel back the onions,
Mhm.
that make up information ops, or what we used to call psychological operations, and information power in the Army. It's neat. I had some talented faculty member that I just had to get out of their way, and let them guide our students through the curriculum.
Mhm.
But they would like to remind me, today we've got more powerful tools. Your ability to reach thousands, through this interface that we call the net, and through social media. Um, you know, the tools are more powerful. Your reach is more instant and broad, but it's fascinating to see how some of the frameworks haven't changed.
Yeah.
Concepts like propaganda, concepts like mis and disinformation, those date back, decades and arguably centuries, right? It's just, instead of the printing press and the paper, now we have these different tools, that make them that much more powerful, and really helps to super empower certain individuals, who are capable of leveraging it, and state actors alike, right? And that was
Sure.
really the crux of that curriculum, which continued to gain interest the entire time I was there. Um, Neat space, great students, um, you know, fascinating opportunities for research. But ultimately, our community that we served, that I served as a chair and as a course director, was to ensure that I was meeting the needs of the defense and intelligence professional of today, right? And how do I prepare them for future service in those fields, um, across the intelligence cycle. And it was constantly evolving throughout the time that I was there, and we always tried to be responsive to the needs of our community. I took that same kind of service mindset, and I think that ultimately led me to the position that I'm in now, over at IARPA, where instead of providing education curriculum to train tomorrow's intelligence professionals, I'm back to something that made me that I was passionate about in my mid-career, which was building capabilities,
Right.
and conducting research, basic and applied research, that can better enable our professionals tomorrow, to do their jobs. And I know you had Dr. Markowitz on a few podcast episodes ago, and he did a good job of hitting some of the wave top, um, descriptions of what IARPA is and what it does.
Right.
Um, but the way I think about it and kind of describe it to teammates is, um, you know, we look at both science and technology intelligence, right? So
Mhm.
what are those advances in the physical sciences, information sciences, um, you know, that are occurring through this convergence of engineering and computational and data, right? That have here to before not been seen, right? Like we're accelerating. There are potentially emerging disruptive technologies that are happening, at very real time. And bio is one of the most interesting spaces, in my opinion. Clearly, I'm
Yeah.
biased, and that's a subjective opinion, but it's been such an awesome opportunity to kind of watch that progress in just the last decade, and that's been empowered by, as much as I'd hate to admit it to my computer science and data friends, not by any new wet science, or wet benchtop, biology, but because of this convergence with engineering and
Yep.
computational power and data, right? The things that we couldn't comprehend before from a genetic standpoint, we now have the computational power and the data sets to do something about it. Whereas before that wasn't the case. Outside of the national labs with supercomputers and capability that wasn't available across the spectrum of the scientific community. So we look at the science and technology intelligence concerns, right? And that is, what are those changes in the sciences that we need to be aware of to posture our defense apparatus, our policymakers, to understand what the potential impacts could be if leveraged by our adversaries.
Right.
The flip side of that coin is, what are those same advances, and then how could we leverage those to be better at our jobs, collecting, analyzing, disseminating intelligence, right? Or in the defense apparatus and across the kind of broad DoD and its partners' mission. So it's really kind of a fascinating space, and I couldn't be more thankful to the leadership over at IARPA for letting me come in. And really, what is kind of a short tour detail or across the line program, to support folks like Dr. Michael Patterson and Dr. Trupti Brumbot, who are my partners on the B24IC program, which, as you kind of pointed out, is focused on biointelligence and biosecurity. Two terms that would be difficult to get an agreement if you threw 12 biologists in a room together. But ultimately, it's looking at things like traditional biological agents and how do we continue to work towards early identification, characterization, and understanding of what those threats pose in a timely fashion, right? As well as novel biological threats that are a challenge of really that dual use construct where there's a lot of good that can be had through medicine and through health, but there's also the potential for malice, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the way to think about those in novel, innovative ways is the challenge of our entire community. But it's specifically the reason for the B24IC program and what Michael and Trupti and I are trying to do as we move forward. There's been some neat space. IARPA's already done some fascinating programs, FungiCat, Felix, MIST, of which I'm sure Dr. Markowitz talked to you about.
Yep.
And looking at how do we leverage the biological sciences, kind of given that rough construct I gave to think about it. But we are continuing to try to evolve that and work on those problems, that aren't necessarily today's problems. Those are important, and there are folks like me that are working on just that. But our task up at IARPA is not today's problems. It's the problems of 15 years from now. It's what's coming over the horizon. And that's a fun space to be in, but it can be risky, right? And it can be a challenge to make sure that we're asking the right questions and that the programs that we fund are feasible, right? As well as innovative. So it's this real neat mix of kind of basic applied research that wouldn't necessarily have a commercial demand signal outside of the ARPAs, trying to push the envelope of science. Unlike the big pharma or biotech where we were talking earlier, Ira, there's different kind of drivers from an economic standpoint, and it's an important space that we fill in the government to try to make sure that science, that basic and applied science that may not have that commercial driver is funded and really, kind of guided to a point where there might be a commercial benefit or an application by our partners, which remain the 18 agencies and departments that make up the intelligence community. Those folks are, it's a small community, the biosecurity, community writ large. So, we work hand in glove with potential transition partners from not inception, but shortly thereafter on, early integration of potential transition partners so we can better understand, their needs. But I'm not looking for one 3-letter agency to support. Our challenge is to provide a capability and programs that could support multiple members of the 18 organizations and departments that make up the intelligence community. Or these cross-cutting requirements as they go about their duties, right? Collecting, analyzing, disseminating intelligence products to inform our policymakers and provide them some form of decision advantage over our adversaries. And that's our goal. I was fortunate enough to be plugged into, like I said, a great team. Dr. Michael Patterson and Dr. Trupti Brombot are my partners in B24IC. And we're really interested to see where that program goes. It's considered a super seedling, so it's intended to really just to think, outside of the box and to cast a wide net across the R&D community, to either confirm or kill off potential ideas that don't make sense, or perhaps there's not a good viable way forward right now in this moment of time for the technology, or to identify those that have potential to become broader programs, and potential investment in the future. I came on board. They were kind enough to give me a space to help add value, and I think what was a very timely moment. So I'll pause there, Ira, and try to get back on your agenda as best as possible. Is there something that I left out that you'd like to hear a little bit more about?
Yeah, no, you touched on everything, and I mean, it's an amazing journey, Jeff. And I'm sitting here listening, and this, as you said a couple of times, actually, this theme of convergence throughout your journey, throughout his career, is so present. Whether it's as you were saying in your master's, where you're bringing, obviously you're studying anthrax, but at the same time you're studying lasers and how to inactivate these materials. One fascinating thing I'd love you to touch on, and you breezed through it at the beginning, but I'd love to come back to your PhD, because you publish on the theme. Your PhD is titled Strange Bedfellows, United States Uniformed Service and Infectious Diseases, and you write about 1918 pandemic and also Ebola, and sort of the unique, or the differences, but also sort of this unifying component of our uniformed services having an important role in managing it. And we've, as you know, we've had Vic Suarez on the show from Operation Warp Speed. We just had Dave Tarantino on from Customs and Border Protection. He's written about some of the same stuff in terms of, we don't think as much about these disasters and not just the microbes, but all the natural disasters where the military has to get involved in as this important role. Talk a little bit about that and your dissertation, if you would.
Yeah, I will, and thank you for that, Ira. So you plus my 3 committee members means there were 4 people that read my dissertation. Thank you.
I didn't read all 1,000 pages, but forget. Yeah.
So I knew I wanted to study, something in the biodefense, biosecurity realm, and like my early prospectus, included, I think a look at that writ large. I hadn't yet decided on the case studies. The timing of the 1918 was a bit serendipitous, right? It was almost 100 years later when I was working on this problem, right? So there was some interest there. Who would know that I would defend in July 2019, and then just months later, right, we would step into, the crisis that we've lived with for the last 3 years. And I take no joy in that, that the timing of that, other than, this is a crisis that if you talk to the public health community, we saw coming. It was just a question of when, right? And then the severity of it. Throughout history, you could set your watch by these events, right? The pandemic and kind of epidemic crises aren't as regular as like the 10 and 100-year floods, that the maritime community deals with, or that we deal with, in flood damage control. But there's a pretty regular pattern, throughout history where you see these things, happen in kind of a cyclic fashion. So we were due, and I'm sad that that the cost was as high as it was, because there are some lessons that were relearned, and it was, there were some fantastic and amazing success stories, right? You mentioned Warp Speed, Dr. Suarez, right? Like, we've never been faced with an epidemic or a pandemic, certainly of this scale in the past, where we're able to quickly characterize the causative agent, right? Sequence it, and then develop countermeasures in the midst of response, right? We didn't do that before with Ebola. We attempted to do that, right? But our investments in 2014 and 2016 didn't bear fruit until years later, right, during the next regional, epidemic. So there are some amazing success stories that we sometimes overlook that were brought to bear by advances in biotechnology and the biological sciences. But my interest was this. I knew I wanted to look at something in biosecurity. I knew I was, a STEM scientist in a social science program, and it was honestly a challenge by a humanitarian professor who will remain unnamed, but is a great American doing good things for the world. But he wrote a kind of a scathing article while I was there at Tufts that in essence pointed out that the securitization of the response was the wrong direction to go. And here I am, right, in a security studies program, embracing this broader security model outside of conventional strategic nuclear forces, but trying to think more in the mindset of the Copenhagen school, where I have to consider things like the economy. I have to consider things like the environment, right? Like we're not taking a holistic approach to our security if we don't. And as somebody who dedicated, at that point, 15 plus years of career, trying to win and fight our nation's war, but also help people, right? Peacekeeping in Kosovo, response to Fukushima. Some of my most rewarding jobs, weren't kicking in doors or fighting IEDs in Iraq. It was delivering school supplies or helping folks, build drinking wells. And, that kind of humanitarian side of what the DoD does is often not played up in the media. But it was it was hard for me to hear, that we didn't have a role. We were the wrong answer to help support this, because I thought that there was. And, what I found in the course of my research, I think, what folks are starting to kind of reconnect with is, early public health, came out of our nation's desire to have a large standing fighting force as far back as the Great Wars, right? So, 1918, the mobilization of American forces into Europe, right, out of Kansas, is one of the positive theses on the origin of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And how our mobilization of forces both across the nation and then overseas helped to spread the disease, right? And that's arguable. There are counterpoints to that, and there's quite a bit of literature that explores the origin of the 1918 pandemic, especially given genomics analysis available today that wasn't available back then. Right. But thinking about the health of a group of individuals, a population, versus the health of an individual, that came about through really the military fighting forces. So strange bedfellows, they're old bedfellows, as well. Like, it's something that we don't commonly put together. Things like the first health insurance came out of the maritime community and our merchant marines, because of sadly a lot of hard working conditions on the docks 100 years ago, but also because of this need to maintain this element of national power and economics through the commercial maritime industry. So there's a long history of public health advances and policies that are hand in hand with the uniformed services. Now, the combat arms, yes, a little less so. A huge contributor in that discussion is the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps of Officers, who they were the ones back in 1918 that were banging on doors and doing the epidemiological surveys to understand the effects of this disease and try to get ahead of it. But the one of the things that I tried to hone in on and make a point of, up until now, this pandemic, which I cited the success of our ability to put together pharmaceutical countermeasures and diagnostics during the crisis. We've never been able to do that before. Right. And even in some of the case studies I looked at, the 2014 to 16 Ebola virus disease, the 1918 pandemic, it was the non-pharmaceutical interventions, right? It was engagements through civic leaders and church groups to talk about, proper protocols for hand washing or the preparation of bodies. It was those kind of things, and really education and outreach, and and shoe gum leather, beating the bushes epidemiological surveys. That's what ultimately got these things in check, right? Or allowed us to get ahead of the proverbial curve, or to flatten the curve of the two epidemics, the epidemic and the pandemic that I looked at. I'd love to spend some time, adding case studies to that framework that I used. But it's a common framework that we use even in our response today. Which there are no secrets to how we do this. We've done it in the past.
Right.
It's hard, and it's not always going to be a technological answer that is going to be the game changer. That doesn't mean we shouldn't invest and strive for it, because as you pointed out, things have changed. We have tools and capabilities that we never had before. And clearly, the scientific community responded to the call during this past pandemic in what I think was stellar fashion. Where we fell a little short was in the info power side of things, which oddly became the other side of my hat, when I was at the National Intelligence University.
Right.
Thank you for asking that question. It's clearly still something I'm passionate about, and I hope to never have to dust off some of my old records and data again during my lifetime or that of my children's.
Jeff, moving to your time at Fort Belvoir, and you introduced us to USANCA and the counterproliferation work, and I have to say, of all the insignias that I've seen from guests on the show, the fact that you have a mushroom cloud on that one, it made me, when I was looking at that, I was like, you know what? This is probably not the job for me. You can give me the Ebola and the VX nerve agent, but I'll let Jeff Bacon take care of that one. But that being said, nuclear, aside from, obviously, God forbid, the weapons component of this, either use of or terroristic related, and then obviously you mentioned energy. Nuclear does other stuff, right? I had Dr. Najat Makhtar from the International Atomic Energy Agency on the show last year. She didn't want to talk anything about nuclear energy. She wanted to talk all about something like the Zodiac project, which is, how nuclear power could potentially be used for, as we discover more and more of these zoonotic agents out there. Nuclear energy is pretty good at killing things. Any interesting, obviously you're very bio-focused, but with that nuclear experience for those 20 some odd years in the back of your mind, any interesting convergence between what you're doing now on the bio and some of sort of the nuclear sciences, let's say? Yeah.
So again, my talented counterpart, Dr. Michael Patterson, is there at IARPA with me. He's responsible for a program called T-Rex. A little outside, of my responsibilities, but it's fascinating. He's got kids. Dinosaurs make sense.
Dinosaurs always make sense.
So, Michael's looking at, in essence, a program that explores biodefense, right? Can I take, let's say, a hair follicle from you, Ira, and look at kind of a chronology of where you may or not have been and potential exposures you may have had to a radiological environment, right? And then what can that tell us? So really looking at the human as the detector in many ways, right? Versus a wipe or swipe or a proximity detection around a particular area of interest that we're trying to hone in on. So yeah, there are some fascinating spaces. From an inactivation strategy, no. I haven't seen that, though. I know others have done work on it that I won't profess to be an expert on. And it's been long enough that I hope I include it in my literature review at least. But, again, I was taking a different approach, high heat, short duration for inactivation. Right. Something that could better simulate, conventional weapons per se.
Sure.
So it was, I am personally very excited that, this administration has kind of picked up where the Obama administration left off. Prior to the Fukushima disaster, where there's, I think, more open-mindedness towards nuclear power and its role in our portfolio, supporting the energy needs of the American people and its allies moving forward. We've got folks like the French who, our oldest allies, love them or hate them, they use nuclear power
Oh yeah.
in a manner that I would argue is something we should consider emulating. Right? They burn longer, they burn hotter. It's a larger part of their portfolio. And right now, what we're seeing, and I'm not a regionalist, so please, I'm sure I'm going to upset somebody, but with a mischaracterization of the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there's a challenge by our European allies because of reliance on Russian oil that the French don't suffer from. Right? We
Right.
don't have the same type of pressures,
Oh yeah.
and that's because of nuclear power, which they've operated safely for years. And I think there's a place for that, but there's a responsible way forward. We still have a waste problem that we have to figure out, and we don't have a great answer for it. That puts the industry at a disadvantage and a challenge. That's a federal government problem that we still have to figure out, right? And I'm not saying reopen Yucca Mountain and that's the solution, but we need to think hard about, what are the power, what are the elements of our power portfolio that really do truly cause a risk and a safety concern, for the American people and the value in terms of their contribution, right? And I don't know, a paper I need to get around to writing someday is I'm fascinated by risk management, risk calculation. You mentioned my time up at OSP Policy, supporting the early months of the COVID crisis. When I went to Fukushima, my roles weren't as, just a planner helping to support the crisis response, because of an expertise in nuclear, contamination. I was asked to help with the decision support models and data visualizations that were required to understand, the extent of the contamination, right? So it was this data visualization and predictive modeling that I keep getting brought back to whenever the flag goes up, for a CWMD crisis. So it's the technical expertise that gets us in the door, but what our policymakers really need are a coherent response from the science community saying, this is what you should really be worried about. This is really where your safety concerns lie. And that's something we sometimes struggle with. I think what we collectively as a scientific community, as a nation and her allies, sometimes what we spend money on is not what is really a risk to us, which may not be what we're scared of, right? And sometimes all three are different.
Right.
And clearly the pandemic was an example. I would argue that was not, we weren't as well invested as I would like us to have been, as a nation state, as a world, right, to prepare for this pandemic that, like I said, for all intents and purposes, was the crisis that we knew was going to come. It was a question of when. So, again, something that really hurt us, right, killed millions, and yet the investment for it compared to some other things are very disparate and imbalanced. And again, I'm not an economist, and I don't punch at that weight level, from a strategic development, across our nation's policies. One of the fascinating things as a functional 52 officer is each time, the proverbial flag has gone up for a CWMD or Suburni related crisis. My role was less as a technical expert talking about my understanding of pandemic or naturally caused disease, or as a nuclear planner, or operations officer. It was leveraging a skill set that I developed back at DITRA upwards of 15 years ago, when I owned a program that looked at decision support tools and hazard prediction models. There is a long turn of the ship to finally get to our most senior leaders to kind of accept and embrace data visualization and predictive models. And each day that passes, it's a more powerful capability that clearly was leveraged, during the pandemic. And I think will become more important moving forward. It's nice to see that leaders aren't just going off their gut and experience anymore, but they're listening to the scientists, they're listening to the data. Our challenge as scientists is to, one, make sure we're speaking in a coherent voice, right, and kind of concerted voice, but also to talk about the limitations of the models.
Right.
I would argue that very early on in the COVID response, we struggled to agree on the best assumptions and criteria to look at when we were putting together the predictive modeling. And this is something that dates back, right? Epidemiological models have a fascinating evolution throughout history, right? So this isn't necessarily new science, but the tools are more powerful, the data sets are more powerful. But early on, we had conflicting models. And as you're watching real time play out and what the observed data sets look like, there was a difference and a disparity, and understandably so, because there wasn't that much data yet. But with each day that passed and the data improved and the quality of inflow, came in, those models improved. But there's a critical point where you've got to make sure you've got the confidence of the senior leaders in order to carry that on and make sure that those models can have the best influence and impact that they can moving forward. I think early on we lost a couple folks because of disagreements between the community, and it was hard getting them back when the models really did start to improve and have good predictive value, right? Or if nothing else, data visualization value, right? To make informed decisions. And that's going to be our challenge. That will only be more of a challenge moving forward because there's more data than there's ever been before, right? There's more, and with that, there's more chaff to separate the wheat from. So that's going to be our challenge. There's some ethical, considerations that I think, somebody smarter than me in international law, are trying to grapple with. But what is it okay for us to use in terms of data sets? I know what's wrong for the intelligence community to use. I know what's wrong for the defense apparatus to use, but what are those limitations? For the broader world, right? Or health, especially health-related data when we have privacy concerns. And that's a fascinating space that's only going to become more challenging because of the tools and how they're evolving. So I got a little off topic. I'm sorry. You asked me to. I think your original question was about my dissertation, and we ebbed all the way up to really my most recent support to OSD policy, a couple years ago.
No, it was spot on, and we segued through USA and CA. So no, that's great, because then it brings us up to IARPA now, which has now they've gotten a hold of you. As you mentioned, you're going to be working in this fascinating ARPA system on this B24 IC program. And obviously, I know these are the early days, and probably a lot of stuff you can't talk about at this point. Seems like it has a little bit of a synthetic biology thing to it. Jeff, what are some of the what are some of the things that get you excited, concern you? Is it? Andy Hebler came on from the White House a couple of months ago. He talked about gain of function, talked about this theme of transmissible vaccines. What are the types of things that, as you're just, scrolling through PubMed and looking for, the next thing that's coming out of a lab, whether it's here in the US or abroad somewhere? What are some of the themes that, concern you or that we should just be interested in as an audience when it comes to this biointelligence, biosecurity, and sort of novel tools, let's say, that are coming online?
Again, it's a fascinating space because the biological sciences have changed so much in the last certainly 20 years. I'm sure we could look at kind of the history of its evolution and expand that a little bit, but I would argue it's ramped up in a fashion, not before seen in the last 2 decades, where it's evolving at a pace, in parallel to that of the computer chip, right, and computational power in many ways. And it's because of those convergences, right? So the most fascinating things that are happening in the biological sciences space is, like I kind of joked before, it's not because of new wet science techniques, on the benchtop. It's because of the data and the computational power and the engineering that's being applied to it. The pandemic, we keep talking about it. One of the things that I hope, comes out of the back end of it is the recognition of our supply chain's fragility. And I think the biological sciences has the potential to help in that space, right? Biomanufacturing, synthetic bio, there's some amazing things that are happening in terms of, what type of chemical precursors and, food ingredients and agricultural products can all be generated through the use of biological agents, right? The manipulation of biological organisms in a way that benefits, kind of mankind, right, and our needs. So biomanufacturing, synthetic bio, there are amazing spaces. I sat through a portion of a National Academy's working group a week ago, that looked at things like additives to cement, right, to help fix cement and infrastructure, right? There are so many, and there, whether you're talking about foodstuffs, whether we're talking about medicine, synthetic bio is a huge space. So we can't ignore that. And I guess if you take anything away from this, while I can't, as a biosecurity, right, specialist, I can't ignore the threat of a biological agent. I can't ignore a naturally occurring disease. I can't ignore man-made threats, right, through some type of manipulation or gain of function, for an existing organism. However, that is quickly becoming the lesser in terms of my own fascination with the biological sciences. There are so many other spaces right now that are evolving in this dual use construct where there's a lot of good that can be had through the manipulation of the biological sciences. We have to understand what the potential malice or unintentional, threat, right? We can't ever, deny the fact that there could be something where there's not a malicious intent, but it doesn't mean that there's not a risk. So it's those non-traditional, threat agent list agents that I'm kind of interested in these days. Those are the fascinating spaces that we try to explore, and it's everything from agriculture to manufacturing to, how we use and leverage, public health data, right, and medicine. So there's a lot of work to be done. The good news is the back end of whether it be the pandemic, whether it be, I would argue the pandemic, right? Success stories and shortcomings. There's a lot of great policy right now that a guy like I can hang my hat on and say, there's priorities, there's needs that aren't being addressed. Our investments need to be guided by these, and we need to do more. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's, like I said, I'm in a fascinating space. My previous work as a research and development, testing and evaluation, RDT&E professional, was when I was at DITRA, and it was much more on, the end of how can I leverage commercial off-the-shelf products or really more advanced research that's closer to the actual application and integration into our warfighters, doctrine and capabilities. Where I'm at now, where all the ARPAs kind of hang their hat, is much further left, right? The basic and applied sciences, the foundational knowledge base that we don't know yet how it's going to bear fruit, but we think there's potential, and we come up with use cases or vignettes. So biomanufacturing is fascinating to me. I live out here in Central Maryland. I can't help but geek out a little bit about really the new energy in space right now that we're seeing. We've got U.S. Spacecom, brought forth by the previous administration. We've got an energy, that's looking at, the stars again. I feel like we as a nation, kind of took some, an economy of effort in that area, for the last decade or so. I think there's going to come a time someday where we discover something in the stars that we need to identify, and we don't have a reference, for, or some type of library to compare it to, and being able to characterize an unknown chemical, biological entity, some type of organic compound, right, and assess it for its potential to cause harm or be a threat to us as humans, right? Because that's ultimately who I'm trying to protect, right? It's not just our elements of national power, but ultimately it's the American people and our allies. We need to be able to characterize something without having a reference library, right? And so that's kind of a throwback to that old biological agents fight that I've been in for the last 15 years. How do I detect something in an austere environment or a contested environment, right, with limited power, limited size? Can I do it for a bread box on a 9-volt battery, right? Can I tell you what this unknown is, as a use case, hypothetical use case? That's never going to go away, right? So, in the space of the biological sciences, there's a lot of discussion about multi-omics, analysis and the omics. And I think that's a fascinating space, right? If I look at, I've got a friend, Dr. Chris Bradburn, who is way smarter than I am, but he will talk to you about the importance of metagenomics. And how if you look at the back end, right, of processes, and we characterize that or leverage the tools available to us, what can that tell us about the systems, right, the processes that occurred for that outcome, that chemical outcome. And that can begin to be the starting point for what I think is needed, which is kind of an effects-based model for threat characterization. Right? Like right now, if I ask people to characterize threat, they already put you in these stovepipes of chemical and biological, right? Or radiological, right? Like that's the framework I grew up in. I would argue if I want to have an effect, I need to look at, there's a number of tools that could be leveraged to achieve that effect on a person, on an industry, on a piece of equipment, on a, and the tool is, could be multiple applications, or it could be a single one. But we kind of got to get out of these stovepipe frameworks that I already get in the way. We're making a little bit of space. There's a peer up at MIT Lincoln Labs, Kathy, who embraces a construct of molecular scientists. Right? We're not chemical chemists, we're not biologists, but we're molecular scientists, because we're really just looking at a function of scale, right? And trying to provide some type of insights into our environment as human beings and the effects of that scale, right, of organisms, compounds, chemistry. And I think that's a neat way to think about it and knock down some of those traditional barriers to collaboration, which are important, because it's not going to be a biologist by himself who solves this problem. It's going to be an engineer, a computer scientist, and a material science, which is always the biggest challenge when we're doing empirical work, right? It's the material science problems. It's a fascinating space to be in right now. I'm no expert. I've got a passion for science, and I've got some experience. But like a lot of lifelong learners, the more you kind of play in this space, the more you realize you don't know, and it kind of just whets your appetite for additional knowledge. It's kind of the neat space about where I'm at right now. A place like the IARPAs really does draw some of the best and brightest. Our collaborators, both in the government and academia, internationally, are amazing. And also never underestimate just the innovative nature of the American people, right? And some of the labs that support us, and the scientists that are banging on these hard problems. And it's not the crusty old graybeards, right? Like me, Ira. It's going to be some young grad student. George Churchill figured out, but this almost graybeard will not be the guy that does it. It's going to be either George, or it's going to be some young postdoc, right, or grad student who just comes at the problem without my biases or experience or hard-learned lessons, but is thinking about this in a different space. At program, we IARPA, by function of being a research institution, the National Intelligence University by being a research and a teaching institution, besides our investments across IARPA's portfolio, a lot of the program managers are intimately involved in ODNI's intelligence or IC postdoc program, ICCAE Research Awards, which I can send you a link and you can possibly add to the metadata for today's podcast. But that's where elements of the intelligence community across ODNI, the 18 agencies, departments that make up the IC, put out hard problems for young scientists and engineers to work on, and it really does draw some amazing talent. It's a pretty good fellowship from a money standpoint for a postdoc, to be honest, and you're working on real world problems, right? Just like I am up at IARPA, and that's I mean, that's what all researchers want, right? Like, it's not something to just have the dusty tome that sits on, my bookshelf and only our committee members and IRA read. It's that you want to make an impact in helping the world, right? Or in this case, helping secure the United States and her allies by providing the intelligence professions, some insights into an element of science that we don't have enough data on. So that's a neat program that like I said, a lot of our IARPA PMs participate in as supervisors and help guide some of these young researchers as they work on some of this problem space. So I don't know, you asked me, what are some of the other things I'm worried about in the biological threat space or sciences space? I gave you the use case for, really, I started to talk about being here in Central Maryland, being fascinated by space.
Right.
That's a fascinating kind of use case that my friend and peer, Dr. Chris Bradburn over at Hopkins APL, has done some previous work on. But, our ability to go out and find something unknown, characterize it, and assess it as a threat creates an interesting use case that can be applied to, like I said, a contested environment, or an environment where our warfighters might have to go and be able to characterize a problem or a threat material with very little power, very little equipment space, very little ability to transmit data. And I think that's a fascinating space for what's a new customer in the IC, right? I said 18. Right. Up until just a couple of years ago, it was 17 members of the agencies, departments that made up the IC. Now we've got U.S. Spacecom, who's a customer, who's got an important growing mission. I think they've got a lot of work to be done still to kind of get up to the pace, with their departmental peers. But there's a lot of smart folks there that are going to do that in a timely fashion. And when they're ready to start looking less inward and more outward in terms of threat characterization, we as a scientific community need to be there to help and be prepared to provide them tools to do what might be needed, not now, but 15 years from now. So that's an interesting space for me. Like I said, biomanufacturing, I feel like we could peel that onion back a dozen different ways, depending upon which definition we wanted to use for SynBio. But there are so many different fields. I would argue there are few elements of the U.S. economic power that could not in some way be influenced, helped, or shaped through the biological sciences. I know there's a reader right now or a listener right now who's thinking, Bacon, you're crazy. And they're probably thinking of a number of examples that don't fit that construct. But it's so well, kind of integrated now as part of our economy, and it's a lot of money in terms of the percentage of our economic might that we can't ignore, and we got to look for those opportunities, and that gives guys like me and you an interesting space to talk about, because I guarantee if we had the same conversation, just a year later, there's already going to be some fascinating changes in this space. Certainly a decade later, but nonetheless,
it's going to be a fascinating coming decade. Fascinating century. Obviously it was all about the 21st century being the century of biology, and it's clearly unfolding. And I think it's great that Jeff, you're there at IARPA thinking about these issues, and just I have a passion as I talk to thought leaders like yourselves, for this ARPA model in general. We see the ARPAization of many areas happening now, and doing an ARPA H episode in a couple of weeks, I'm pretty excited about. But these models that there are creative ways to get things done, and it's not the old stodgy thing model. Whatever, it serves its purpose, but there's other ways to. So as I said, I'm glad that there are folks like you, Jeff, there thinking about these issues, whether they're biosecurity threats, whether they're nuclear threats, and everything in between. It's a fascinating journey. I said it before. I wish you, I know these are the early days of your time at IARPA, but I wish you the best with it as this and you and your colleagues work on a B2 4IC program. For everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode of the show across the various podcast networks, or going to be watching on our YouTube channel, again, you've been listening to Dr. Jeffrey Bacon, program manager at the Intelligence Research Project activity, focusing on this amazing program of biointelligence and biosecurity to keep us all safe. Jeff, I really want to thank you for taking the time to take us on a deep dive of your journey. Obviously, thank you for doing what you've been doing and keeping us safe on all these fronts. Obviously, thank you for your long service to the United States. And as we like to say again on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow through the continued evolution of study and development of these technologies. And it's just really fascinating story, and I really appreciate you telling it to us.
Ira, thank you, and for your listeners for kind of giving me a platform to talk about some of the unique opportunities I've had as an active Army officer. Always available to you and your listeners if anyone wants to follow up and ask questions that I can help further explore, answer, or collaborate on.
Will do. I see future episodes. Be well, Jeff.